Good morning. All right, today we have with us here Dr. John E. Fernandez. He's a professor, architect, father, even snowboarder. But today he comes to us with his architect hat on as a professor of architecture and urbanism at MIT. So we gotta save the slopes maybe for another day. He's quite literally actually building a better world through his focus on sustainable urban futures. And to this end, he founded MIT's Urban Metabolism Group and directs MIT's Environmental Research and Action Program, advancing circular economies and natural climate solutions for cities. This work, he's touched cities that crisscross the entire globe, and his expertise is highly sought after by organizations like UN Habitat, US State Department, EPA, US Green Council, and also us, Albright Fellows. He's a practicing architect, and alongside his wife, he's completed over 2.5 million square feet of low energy and net zero carbon buildings. And right now, he's putting Boston on the map, actually, through the creation of the world's largest passive house office building. So that just means passive house uses 80 to 90% less energy than a typical one. And so next time your friends come into town, your parents come out for graduation, be sure to add Winthrop Center to your iconic sites itinerary alongside Freedom Trail and BPL. And with that, voila, here is the man himself. And so help me welcome Dr. John E. Fernandez.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that very enthusiastic introduction. So I'm thrilled to be here. I mean, two things I want to say before I start my presentations. One is Madeleine Albright was a good family friend, and it was purely social. Her farm was across the road from our farm in Virginia, and so she was. It touches me to be here with this group. So thank you so much for the invitation. And the second thing is that my best friend, while I was at MIT, was a Wellesley student. And she became an architect. She took her studio courses at MIT. And until recently, she was the head of essentially the Association of Architects in Spain. She lives in Madrid. Her name is Belén Hermida. And just wanted to say that as well as a personal point. So I'm going to talk about this idea of city-states as ecological first movers for the major environmental challenges that we have. I'll go into what those are. But I wanted to start out first with this observation. So you might know that cities dominate the world economy. Approximately 70 to 80, it depends on how you measure it, of world GDP is either directly or indirectly managed and motivated through urban economies. The first bit of that film was Shanghai. The second is the port. And so port cities themselves are a super important element of the world economy. And that's just one function that cities perform. Their financial role in the economy, their role in mobilizing enormous amounts of resources, material and energy resources. It's all very well researched and clear. So we are living on a planet of cities. Cities dominate the direction economically, politically, socially, culturally, and environmentally of the planet's future. I think that's one of the things that's not really super well appreciated by the general public, and certainly not by some academics as well. So the meta question I want to ask, and I'm interested in your thoughts, and so I'm going to do this in about 40 minutes. I've got a lot of material. I tend to talk fast, but is what is the geopolitical and biophysical role of cities in the 21st century? That's the meta question. I have other themes that I'm going to be addressing in more detail, but that's really the question that motivates this entire presentation. I want to start out with some fundamentals, right? So when I say ecological city-states, what do I mean? Towards an era of regeneration. So first, ecological city-states, the working definition, an urban area, including metropolitan regions. So when you might know, so Madeleine, you're well aware that a city is a city and a metropolitan region is a different thing. It's a city and all of its extended, mostly economic and population density. So you can say that there's one metropolitan region from Boston all the way down to Washington on the east coast of the United States. So that's what I mean by metropolitan region. That have explicit articulated priorities, goals, and measures towards improving the global environmental conditions. That's what I mean by an by a ecological city-state. It has that goal. New York City, you can argue, is an ecological city-state. It has the status of a neo-state, the funding, the kind of economic footprint of a small country, essentially. And it has very explicit priorities towards improving the environment. Boston, similarly, much smaller, but similarly. And guided by the 9 planetary boundaries. So some of you, raise your hand if you know what that is. Okay, so Johann Rockström is a good friend, researcher, Potsdam Institute in Germany, who was the lead on defining the 9 most challenging environmental issues that we face. And they're called the 9 planetary boundaries. They're boundaries because he and his group established thresholds beyond which we get into high-risk zone. So like, for example, 350 parts per million carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere. More than that induces high risk in climate effects, weather effects. And there are 8 others. Climate change is one of them, and there are 8 others. So ecological city-states are really focused in on what are the 9 planetary boundaries, what are the challenges that we face, and importantly, as city-states, there's some element of the way in which these cities operate, behave, in which they have a certain independence in their urban governance, independence from the national, from the federal, independent from the regional, and therefore that independence links them to other cities around the world that have that sort of autonomy and independence. Okay, so that's ecological city-states. Era of regeneration is moving beyond the commodification of materials, labor, and technology. This is very succinct definition of capitalism. That's what capitalism is, right? And so moving beyond a purely capitalist, market-driven ethos to something else that sustains biogeophysical flows. Biogeophysical flows. I'll get a little bit into that a little later. So who's in the sciences here? Okay, so I'm assuming there's some knowledge then about geophysical flows. And then era of regeneration is setting the stage for a 21st century of leapfrogging, meaning adopting technologies that are more advanced than technologies we use today without going through that first stage. In other words, adopting very large-scale, grid-scale solar photovoltaic without ever having built any coal-fired power plants. Sort of skipping a lot of fossil energy technologies and just going straight to renewable energies. This is most important and actually critically important, and actually the path of what we do in climate change, it will be determined by what happens in emerging economies. Okay, so that's what I mean by ecological city-states and regeneration. Okay, so why are we talking about city-states? Want to make the quick point that because countries have failed us, because international agreements and cooperation has failed. Now, that doesn't mean they shouldn't continue. That doesn't mean we shouldn't redouble our efforts. I'm completely behind that. But you have to at least recognize that the carbon emissions trajectory over the years since 1950, the only signals of dramatic reductions, although not long-term reductions, are really economic shocks to the system. This is the 2008 financial crisis. This is the financial crisis, the dot-com bust. This is the pandemic right here. That's what has tended to reduce carbon emissions. And again, I probably should have gone through this, but greenhouse gas emissions, gigaton CO2 per year, global warming potential, right? So that's what that graph says. And if you simply superimpose the international conversations on climate, beginning with the Rio Earth Summit in '92, and then importantly, the Conference of the Parties in Berlin, the first one. And I'm not going to define all of these things. Please ask me questions. Or if you have a question, what is COP? Please raise your hand. Okay? Please raise your hand at any point if the point I'm making is not clear to you. That's important for me. And then COP3 Kyoto, which was a really landmark meeting of the UN on climate change, and then all the way to, and this is a little old, so 2023. This is the last COP that I have listed here in the UAE, and between those 28 Conference of the Parties, I went to 10 of them, and they're enormous. I mean, the last one I went to was in Glasgow, and I think it was something like 30,000 people, 35,000 people. And so these things are enormous events, and they are meant to be the event that determines the path of carbon emissions for the next, several years. And so the point I'm making here is that given the carbon emissions increase, we've had a 45% increase during the time where there has been an acceleration and a real attention to talking about climate change in the international arena. And so therefore, the international discussions and nations discussing and acting on climate change has failed. That's my point, okay? The other point I really want to make is, I already alluded to it, is that climate change is now the future of climate change is no longer really a developed nation issue as a deterministic factor in where we go with climate change. Of course, it's super important what the United States does. It's super important to be aware what the United States is doing right now and has been for the past year and a half. But the emissions themselves are coming from now more emerging economies. So these are emerging economies emissions have now surpassed mature economies. And so the future of carbon emissions is going to be based on what emerging economies are doing. And urbanization is increasing by about 100% in the next 30 years, meaning that we're doubling the urban population. 90% of that's happening in emerging economies, okay? So this is where that hopefully sets the stage for you. So let's go back to then the notion of moving beyond the commodification of materials, labor. And so this is a quote from this fantastic book on capitalism. We live in this world created by capitalism. The ceaseless accumulation of capital forges cities. So this is one of the first results of capitalism, is the creation of cities, human settlements for which capital was a major factor in their growth and their economies. This determines the way we work. It allows an extraordinary number of people to engage in unprecedented levels of consumption, influences our politics, and shapes the landscape. So impossible to look at Earth and miss the world historical force of capitalism. And today it's impossible to look at Earth and not realize that it's a planet of cities. So the connection between capitalism and cities is extremely important. So let's dive into that. Prior to the emergence of capitalism, cities were acting as essential nodes of the economy. So there were many cities, there was a whole world of cities before capitalism. So capitalism, remember, it's the commodification of materials, labor, and technology for the purpose of generating greater capital. Capitalism is, and this is just a straight up, this is not Marxist in any way. This is just straight up definition of capitalism. Capitalism exists to create more capital, right? So prior to the emergence of capitalism, cities were acting. They were part of the Great Connecting, and the historians make this point about the world having connected very early on. In the 9th, 10th, 11th centuries, the world was already connected by way of long-distance trade routes. And the history of cities was really central to the geopolitical interests and dynamics of those trade routes. I'll go into that a little bit more details in a little bit. Capitalism is also a unique economic, social, and political condition for cities. And cities are the home to the capital itself, to the individuals and the organizations that own capital. So again, the connection, the symbiosis between urbanization, cities, from the very earliest cities, and pre-capitalism and then capitalism is very, very strong. The reason this is important is to know that these cities acted because they became really powerful by way of this accumulation of capital, long distance trade routes, and the rise of merchants. Merchants were the first proto-capitalists. They were the first non-religious, non-state sponsored, non-hereditary wealthy people in the world, right? And they created their own wealth by way of trade. And the physical consequences of that at a geopolitical level. So who is interested in geopolitics? Okay, all right, so I thought it might be a big interest. So the point I'm making here is that the geopolitics back 9th, 10th century was already thick with the interests of merchants by way of how do you regulate these long-distance trade routes? What happens when my goods arrive in a city? Who's monitoring those? Is there a tax? How do they get warehoused? How do they get then distributed? How do I make sure they're not stolen? All of these things were part of that landscape, and that created enormous cities: Timbuktu, Bruges, Cairo, Aden, Baghdad, Bukhara, and Guangzhou. Guangzhou, today now Shenzhen, is, what is it, 18, 20, 22 million people? So some of these cities became extraordinarily large and had many, many different lives. Some other cities, they had their heyday back in the 11th, 12th centuries. And I just want to focus in on Aden for one moment. So Aden, in what is now Yemen, was the main connection between between European markets and Middle Eastern markets and India and the Far East. Aden itself was, in the 11th century, was one of the largest cities in the world. Literally hundreds of thousands of people, most advanced, most knowledge produced, most innovation, technology innovation. This is actually an image from later when, in the 13th, 14th centuries, when Europeans then started to develop their Far Eastern trade routes as well. So Aden, as a city, today it's in the Yemen, it's in the middle of major conflict, had an extraordinary role in the pre-capitalist development of cities. And then much later on, I'm doing this super fast, much later on, several centuries forward, 16th, 17th century, cities then, having been established as the nodes to trade, very simply being the place where goods arrived and then they're either bought or sold, maybe distributed, or they move on. Those cities grew large enough, and there was enough capital that was created and enough wealth created in those cities that then they became the gateways to accessing the regions, the hinterlands, the agricultural regions where they were situated. So cities then became gateways to, sorry you can't see this very well, it's a little dim, but this is one of my favorite painters of this almost abstract, the details here, I'm a huge fan of art history, the almost abstract depiction of this agricultural scene. But this was happening in the mid-16th century, where agriculture was now dominated by capital. There had already been, these workers were no longer serfs, they were now wage laborers. And that was a huge change because they now no longer actually had a farm themselves. They may be living somewhere here, maybe temporarily, but many of these people, as capital became the gateway to regions and agriculture, then enclosures happened. Then large landowners started to enclose property and say, you can't live on my property any longer. You can work here and I'll pay you, but you can't live here. And so that then led to people moving to the city, right? That was one of the first waves of migration to cities. And then a really important part of capitalism, which I could go on for 3 hours, is war capitalism. So the dispossession of lands, indigenous lands, in the southern Americas, but also less so in India and in China, because India and China had structured, they had codification of ownership of lands and different resources in ways that other indigenous peoples, mostly in the Americas, did not. And so war capitalism became an extraordinarily useful and helpful engine for driving wealth creation. And Europe developed on war capitalism, which was funded through slave labor. And you could just look at the history of the growth of European cities, all of the major cities. Paris, when you look at the history of Paris, you can see that a major influx of wealth into Paris to develop Paris, as we see it today, was slave labor. And so all of this then leads to cities also then, another huge role, is gateways to ecological, extraction that led to enormous ecological damage. By the mid-1800s, by the mid-19th century, in the Americas, you now had cities that many of them had started as fortresses, military encampments, that then became trading posts and then became the nodes of extraction from the landscape. So you can't see this very well, I don't think, but those are bison skulls, right? And this is one of just many images. The 1880s, there's a book, I'm not remember what it is, but it'll come to me in a second, that makes the argument that the mid-1880s to the beginning of the 20th century was the worst period for ecological damage, actually even worse than it is today. And this is an image of a copper mine in Butte, Montana, which today it's frozen over here, has a toxic lake. You might have heard about this place in Butte, Montana. It's extraordinarily toxic. Every once in a while, a flock of birds will land on it and then die. I mean, it's a terrible thing. It still exists. And this is just representative of the kind of mobilized extraction by way of the engine of capital that went through cities that led to this kind of environmental damage. Okay, so before I go into the research then, the point I want to make here is this notion of cities having a global footprint. We have to get beyond this sense that cities are local. Cities have always been global. The largest cities have run the planet. And many mid-sized cities, so cities that are in the interior of countries that act as gateways for extraction, for those commodities that go onto the world market, they're part of this connected global network. So cities have always superseded the kind of boundaries of national governments, right? That's the first thing to get beyond. And that's just a totally conservative, really well founded reading of history, right? So this notion of cities today adopting a kind of city-state status is not a radical notion. It's actually the kind of the way they operate. And I came to this idea partly through my research and reading history and all that, but also by traveling an enormous amount. So I've been to 75 countries in the world, mostly to cities in those countries. And you understand that cities are not looking just to their federal government. They're looking to other cities and other countries and other regions. So that's the first point. The second point is, as drivers of capital, as the home stewards of the individuals, the organizations that own capital, cities have an enormous potential to completely direct the way we go on how do we value the future and how do we price environmental degradation? How do we even begin to contend with that? And I think this is a conversation that was started years ago at one of the conference of the parties. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. Lots of people talking about this, but there isn't enough movement because the federal, national level of actions by governance tends to mask what cities are doing. Okay, so given that, then, I started the group Urban Metabolism, the Urban Metabolism Group at MIT about 15 years ago, not on this theme, just asking one question. And the question was, we know through historical research and all that, the flows of capital through cities, all that, but do we know what the physical footprint of cities is throughout history and today? In other words, how much water, energy, materials do cities consume? How much do they mobilize? How much do they enable the extraction of? You know, what's the role of cities in terms of material flows? And there's a set of studies. There's a kind of a loose confederation of researchers that you can label as socio-metabolic researchers. They do the work to connect everything happening in society, social, cultural, everything, technological, with material flows. And so we launched the Urban Metabolism Group because no one had been doing this in cities very, very much. There had been a little bit of work done. My book came out in 2013, and right now I'm on sabbatical for the year until the fall, and I'm writing a much, much bigger book on urban metabolism. Okay, so urban metabolism is the study of the flow of resources that serve cities. Another way you can say that is it's the study of the resource intensity of cities. What resources and how much do they consume, do they mobilize, and everything else, as I said. And there's been a lot of work throughout the decades that's sort of does one-off analyses. This one's of London of 2000, and then it simply accounts for all the different materials and how much, and it's useful to know because essentially this is a map of its resource intensity, which also then leads you to the question of how unsustainable or sustainable is it or could it be, right? Where are there efficiencies to be had? So this is all much more technical work than what I've been talking about. The first third of this presentation was all history and other things. This is more technical, which is that the first formal question that was asked about the resource intensity of cities was by Abe Woolman, who wrote an article on the metabolism of cities. So Abe Woolman wrote this article on the basis of a thought experiment. If you had 1 million Americans, how much would they consume? Do we even know? And he found out that we didn't know. So he did the calculations, and 625,000 tons of water, fuel, air pollutants, all that. Okay, so that's interesting, but then others started to take this up. So what's the thermodynamic balance of cities? And this gets very, very academic. And I am using the word academic in a sort of a pejorative sense that some of this is interesting. Is it useful? I don't know, right? So, but there was a lot of work done, partly also because it was driven by the academic question, but also post-war United States, you could see the consumption of resources in cities was a problem. This is Los Angeles in 1948. And, the smog in Los Angeles was one of the major factors to the passage of the Clean Air and Water Acts. Huge factor in the establishment of the EPA by a Republican president, Richard Nixon, which is currently being, disemboweled right now. But this is a popular thing. People knew that, well, our consumption is kind of out of control, and where you see it in cities is really, really apparent. This is a photograph that I took, and it's not, I know it's dim, and the image is dim, but this is literally, you could not see further than about 150 meters in Beijing in 2018. Yeah, 2018 at 11 in the morning. And I was there for 2 weeks, and I've been to China maybe 15 times. This was very typical and lasted the entire time I was there. And so the connection between resource intensity consumption, the economy, and cities is very, very clear, very apparent. And even before people saw these sorts of things, there had always been, actually way back in history, but I'm beginning here in the 19th century and early 20th century, there'd always been interest in how do we make cities actually more aligned with the environment, with nature, with livability. And the Green Cities movement, this is work of Ebenezer Howard in different places in England and Australia and the United States, developed plans in which the city was part of a garden. It was essentially a garden city. Interestingly enough, do realize this is the home for inebriates, right? This is an insane asylum. There were a couple of other curious ones in here. So the social priorities behind this were not as we would hold, but back then, even then, there was a sense that the city itself was disengaging us from nature and also having effects on nature that were not great. Frank Lloyd Wright had his own very compositional version. The performance of this was, who knows whether it would be better or worse for the environment. And then there was a little bit more work on the science side. Ian McHarg wrote this book, Design with Nature. The planners know it. And it was seminal in the sense that planning itself then had to take into consideration nature, the environment, and actually in this work, physical flows. The flow of water, the flow of air, the flow of pollutants, biophysical elements. And biophysical, so let's delve into that a little bit. So from the biosphere, so biological production, primary production from plants. So photosynthesis, the things that plants make, and also how they grow and everything else. And everything, and the non-biological or the abiotic, physical flows. Things like nutrients like nitrogen, phosphorus, carbon. So all those flows should be part of the way that planners are thinking. And it's just a new idea. And planners before then, this was not really part of what they were doing. So that leads us to my work with the Urban Metabolism Group. Okay, so if you really, urban metabolism takes at face value the idea that there's value in accounting for the physical flows, knowing how much goes in, how it's used, how it's consumed, and then what goes out. And to do that, then we use system dynamics and material flow analysis. Material flow analysis is physical accounting. It's like financial accounting. It basically just lists and then accounts for types of and then volumes of or weights of different materials that contribute to the city. So there are inputs. And inputs are water, energy, materials, biomass, and then some regional hidden flows that just pass right through. And there are active and passive. Active are what we drive. So when a tanker of oil comes to Boston and offloads, that oil is then burned in Boston. That's an active flow of an energy carrier, right? When a bird flies through Boston and defecates and then flies on and leaves Boston, that's a passive flow. We don't control that. When the wind blows, we don't control that. When the river flows, we don't control it. So they're both active and passive, and it's important to include the passive because those are huge flows. And then there are the outputs, same active. So when our waste, the heat that's generated, and then the passive outputs. So okay, so here's the diagram, which there's a lot in here. And it's in my book if you want to go into more detail. But basically, this says that the inputs, both active and passive, but let's just focus on the active, what we control and what we manage, contributes to three fundamental things in a city. To goods and services, and that's a huge catch-all. Everything from the water that you're drinking to the clothes that you buy, it's all goods and services. The second thing are building the environment and infrastructure, the built environment and infrastructure, right? So that's all the buildings, the roads, And then the third thing is transportation. And so it seems strange to sort of separate that out, but transportation is distinct from the built environment and infrastructure because these three things follow on from the way in which urban economics defines cities. Has anyone taken an urban economics class? No. So 20 seconds on urban economics. Urban economics defines cities as the presence of workers and firms, places of employment, co-located with housing where the cost of transportation goes to zero. That's literally the economist's definition of a city. Every city does that. No city doesn't do that, right? And that's the definition of economics that they use then to generate a whole slew of economic equations to be able to understand. And I know some people are asking questions. So it's I'll say it again. So it is the presence of workers and firms, places of employment, co-located with housing, where the cost of transportation goes to zero. The cost of transportation goes to zero just means that you're close to the thing, right? You're close to your, when I used to live in New York City, I would walk to work. The cost was the caloric cost for me, and so the food I had to buy, that was the cost, but approaching zero. So these mimic those elements in urban economics. And we did that on purpose so that when we account for the physical flows, we're actually generating the same kinds of equations that urban economics generates so that we can be aligned with the urban economic notion of what a city is. And then there are things like a municipal sink, which just means the things that are added to a city which are, for all intents and purposes, permanent. So the materials that went to building the Prudential Tower are kind of there to stay for a very long time, right? The Prudential Tower is not going to go away anytime soon. The fill that filled in the Back Bay to Boston, that's there to stay, right? That was an input, and that's not going to be taken away. So those are additions to sink. And this diagram then has structured all of our work. We've done work to assess the urban resource consumption of Boston, Los Angeles, Lima, Peru, and a bunch of others. One of the things that we established was, back when we started the Urban Metabolism Group, we asked the simple question, what's the resource intensity of cities? Do we know per capita how much people, materials, energy, water, everything? And the literature was really, really light. And that work that had been done by Abe Woolman and others sort of partially answered the question. So we really wanted to do a definitive study to know today, if I'm living in a particular city, how much do I consume per capita on average? And so we did that work, and we came up with a range. And the range is, I'll just say as a sort of foreshadow, is the range is a reflection of inequity on the planet. And this is why I say that. So we did also some analysis on pre-fossil fuel cities. So the thing about anthropology is it actually knows, anthropology knows actually to a better extent what human settlements consume than many researchers know about what we consume today. First of all, the kinds of things that they consume are very, very limited, and anthropologists have done extraordinarily detailed studies. Basically, what they're looking at are the wastes, the residue, the kinds of materials that people consumed when they were living in a particular place. So we did enough work to establish that the pre-fossil fuel urban economy per capita, so per person, amounted to about 1 ton per capita. So that means when I put in water, materials, all food, materials for clothing, for shelter, and everything, and energy, right? And the wood to burn for the fire, to cook, whatever, it amounted to about 1 ton per capita. Today, transition urban economies, cities in those economies, and these transition economies are economies that are transitioning from a late industrial revolution type to today's economy, more service-based and all that. So Eastern Europe, some parts of Southeast Asia, some countries in Latin America, and other places. Today, the average is about 12 to 30 tons per capita. And fully developed urban economy, and not just in developed economies, but also in emerging economies, 30 to 100. 100 plus, actually the 100 plus has got, is a big range. We have found that some cities, so Singapore, if you live in Singapore, your urban resource consumption per capita is upwards of, therefore, north of 300 tons per capita. And that's an average person living, actually not the richest people living in Singapore, but average. And so there's a huge range between 12 and plus 300. And in fact, people living in the lowest income, the poorest people living in cities and emerging economies in the world actually are consuming more like 1 ton per capita. So this is a reflection of and it's a very close corollary to income levels around the world, that we have a range from about 1 ton per capita and even less to 350 and maybe even more in the world of resources. Yes?
I just wanted to clarify what's the unit of consumption that you're measuring?
Yeah. So the unit is, I didn't explain that well enough. When you put everything in a basket, the materials, water, energy carriers, everything else, and you weigh it, right? That's why we're using tons. And it's an aggregate number, so you're simply weighing it. And it's an average for that person, then that's what you're getting. That's the unit. So that's what ton is referring to. Okay. So that was one of the first things that we did. That took a couple of years. And then soon after that, and we had done a number of studies of individual cities, and a lot of it, there are about 5 or 6 urban metabolism groups around the world now. And the typical work that they do, great work and all that, but typical work is to look at a city or a group of cities and to do the deep analysis on that city. And we could do that forever. But we decided that we wanted to ask the question, are all cities basically, is this range that I just mentioned, is that a smooth gradient from the most efficient or poorest, however you want to put it, to the most resource intensive? Is that a smooth range? Are there cities that are like one another? Do they cluster? Is there the possibility of a typology of urban resource consumption? So we did this work about 7 years ago, actually longer than that. The first phase, we used statistical analysis, and we had good data on the resource intensity, the consumption of resources within those 200 cities of biomass. So this is wood and food, fossil fuel, total electricity, total energy, electricity, CO2 emissions as a proxy for consumption, industrial minerals and metals, total materials, and construction minerals and metals. And so we had data for 200 cities for all those things. And I know this is a little bit mind-numbing. It's not that exciting, but I'm going to get to the punchline here. This is essentially what we wanted to use to establish whether you could take all that data and cluster it. Has anyone done cluster analysis? Statistical cluster analyses? So cluster analysis is where you have ideally a large set of members, and you know a lot about them, but you want to know, are any members more like other members within that group than they are the rest of them? And is there meaningful clustering that I can do? And you can, political analysts do this. We're all different, but we cluster in terms of our preferences, our consumption, and all that. And so political analysts, they'll cluster populations to be able to say, the independence, when you hear independence, that's a clustering, right? And so we asked the question, could we cluster cities? Because if you could cluster cities, then you can say something about all of those members. You don't have to go and analyze every single city from now on, right? And you can even, if you can cluster cities, and you can even do it in a robust way that you know very little about a member that's in a cluster, but you know a lot about other members within that cluster, then you can say, that member probably is like the other members, and the whole point of this is to say, how do cities become more sustainable? And this led us to the thought that there is no singular path to sustainability for cities. There's no sustainable city. There are different kinds of sustainable cities. And you can sort of intuitively sense, well, a city in a hot, tropical, emerging economy, its sustainability path is probably different than a city in Sweden, right? Intuitively. And so we wanted to understand, do cities cluster? If they cluster, are there pathways to sustainability actually a collective effort? So we then, the results of phase one were these 15 types. We did 7 or 8 clustering analyses and ended up with these groupings. And they are from and so I actually didn't describe this. This radial graph is a normalized graph where low, medium, high, right? I think that's probably obvious. But, total energy, low consumption, medium, and high, normalized along all those factors, right? Just so that we could present it graphically. So these are graphic representations of groupings of cities. So Boston is in the highest category, right? We consume the most in everything, right? And we're alongside Phoenix, Denver, Detroit, Melbourne, Sydney, cities that have, many of them have challenging climates, but also are very high, they're high income cities. And the tightest correlation between any one of those resources and income was electricity. The more electricity you consume, the higher your income, and vice versa, right? And so, and then going down from there, you get, European cities, Eastern Europe transition economy cities in here, and then you're getting cities with large populations of very low income. So the question then asks, we then ask the question, so what's a sustainable city? Where is sustainability in this graph? It's not here because these cities are resource efficient because a lot of people living in those cities are consuming not as much as they should be. They don't have access to electricity, potable water, and everything else. So there's really equity issues here. I mean, obvious point, this is not the future for sustainable cities in the future. So it's probably somewhere in the middle. And I'm not saying that these are sustainable cities, but I'm saying that the profiles are kind of interesting. So there's one side note. All of these types have cities from very different regions of the world. That was surprising to us. So, but not so much when you really dive into the details because, for example, Abu Dhabi, Kuwait, Doha, Riyadh, under here should also be Juneau, Alaska, and a couple of other places. Cities in regions saturated with fossil energy reserves are kind of one type. They sort of exhibit similar, energy consumption is to the max, and CO2 emissions is also very high, right? You get that. But these are a little bit, they're mixed. And the only type of cities, there was actually one type of cities that are all located in one country that are different from every other city, are cities in Japan. Japanese cities are unlike any other cities. And it's a combination of things. It's a combination of very industrialized, high import of materials with very frugal individual consumption. And I could go further into that, but it's kind of interesting thing. So the idea of using this typology is to how do we migrate these cities towards the middle? How do you migrate these cities towards the middle? Because these people need to consume more. And so one of the strategies to consuming more is leapfrogging high carbon intensity technologies using renewable energy and the rest of it. So I've gone on for way too long on that. So so as I said, that's the graphic. So that leads to then this tool, and I have 7 minutes, so I'm going to see if, 7 minutes, so I'm going to see if this is going to work. I asked the team not to be working on the tool today, but this is an online tool. I can get you the URL. Basically this, can you see that? I know it's really dim. Okay. Yeah, it would be kind of. So taking everything that I said, taking everything that I said, what I thought we should do, I'm sure they'll figure it out, so I'm going to use, is can we make this information available to cities, to municipal authorities, to mayors? Very early on in my work in cities, I learned that mayors don't learn from reading research papers. Mayors learn from other mayors. They learn from other municipal projects. That's where they learn. How do they connect with one another? And it's really nice and quaint and sweet when cities have sister cities, right? But wouldn't it be maybe even better if a sister city that's in a type, similar type, that wants to do sustainability, get in touch with another city in that type that's done more on sustainability than they have, because their pathway to sustainability is likely more relevant to them than others. So we developed this tool. It basically takes our typologies and provides you the ability to do some clustering. And I tried it before. The Wi-Fi is good, but it's a little slow. So I'm going to see if the city profile, energy consumption per capita, let's see. Oh, it did come right up, but you can't see that. Okay, so let's see. Missing input. Okay, hold on one sec. You can choose the number of types that you want because okay, there we go. All right, so if this takes longer than 15 seconds to process, then I'm just going to move on. Basically, you can ask it questions. Okay, there you go. So you're getting a result on the 10 different types of cities by way of, what did I choose, energy consumption, or the urban morphology. So the urban morphology is the physical layout of the city, right? And so this returns, it's actually not, the returns are not that interesting because there's only one that's different. And it will give you the built-up area, it'll give you the amount of green area within a city, it'll tell you the density of the transportation network and other things. And then we also have, as part of this tool, a policy part to it, which is being developed. So that policy part tells you about all of the actions that different cities have taken on different topics, and then we'll connect you to those cities. We'll connect you to the cities that have done a particular thing in, let's say, green infrastructure, let's say green water treatment, right? Blue infrastructure. And it will connect you to those cities, not just those that have done something, but those that have done something within your type. And then those that are adjacent to your type. And then those that are even a little bit further from your type. We're going to launch this tool in the spring with an effort to connect it to mayors and all that, because we want this to be the platform by which cities communicate with one another on sustainability in a scientifically rigorous way, so that they can then do the initial analysis, see some of the primary research that this is based on, and then move from there. Okay, so I could spend a lot more time on that, but I'm going to go on with the last part of this. So cities and regenerative political economy, what is it going to take? And so I'm going to fast forward through some of the main topics here. So sharing knowledge, the tool that I just showed you. Sharing that knowledge, this is super important. It's only the largest, most well-resourced cities that have even an individual or two who can spend some of their time on urban sustainability. The resources that cities have are very, very, very limited. So sharing knowledge is really important. And also mobilizing the power of procurement. Cities buy a lot of stuff, and they can really be movers in the market. Noting the fact that many cities are inherently transboundary. They are trading with other countries, other regions, and they have a transboundary role, which goes back to the city-state idea. Again, the research that I showed you shows that cities have this significant physical footprint that's global, that's related to other cities like them around the world. So how might they be able to then act as responsible consumers, producers within their region, even across national boundaries, but also then leverage international development funds. So we've actually worked with a number of cities in attracting funding from international development organizations that almost always are just looking at countries. And then the global urban ecological leadership needs to include climate change, but biodiversity. So I mentioned the 9 planetary boundaries before. The latest work in the 9 planetary boundaries shows definitively that climate change and biodiversity are the 2 most challenging issues that we face and ripple through all the other 7. So I'll show you a little bit of work on biodiversity and then on climate change. And again, really important for emerging economies. Okay, the notion of city-states, as I mentioned before, and the conversations started years ago, but they really did get a boost through adversity at the beginning of the first Trump administration when the US government pulled out of the Paris Agreement. So Michael Bloomberg, Pittsburgh Mayor Bill Peduto, Jerry Brown of California, and others got together to sort of pledge that we were still in, and that subnational actors, that's the kind of wonky phrase that's used to indicate cities in the Conference of the Parties. The UN loves that kind of language. Subnational actors became much, much more important in climate negotiations. One of the things that, again, you have the reference for this, some of the work that we've done has resulted in this work on the planning, urban design, architecture for climate action for cities. This just came out, and so it's the latest information on how cities can act, and a great deal of the discourse here has to do with the global perspective of cities. And it also gives you localized strategies that we know very well: efficiency of urban systems, the morphology, the buildings themselves, green infrastructure. And then another publication on the biodiversity side is a group that I was involved in with the World Economic Forum on biodiverse cities. What is a biodiverse city? How biodiverse can a city be? And what is the role of cities in global biodiversity? So that's a publication. Because some of the work that we had done, just to describe this diagram, is that if you take the global biosphere, so this is the planet, right? And this is the urban land area. Obviously, nothing's to scale. This is just representing things, right? Urban land area. There are 3 zones in which biodiversity is affected by cities. The first zone, obviously, within the city itself, right? Within the urban land area. We don't have bears in Cambridge. Maybe you have them here in Wellesley. I was going to say in Wellesley, but no, we don't have them in Cambridge. So they've been extirpated, right? They're not going to. So that's the first, and that's an important one, but it's really small, right? It's 1 to 3% of land area. The other zone, which is quite important, is the peri-urban zone, right, on the outskirts. So Wellesley's on the outskirts of the large metropolitan area of Boston, so you probably do get coyotes, right? And so those are 2 zones, but the zone that is affected the most by global urbanization is everything else, the non-urban zone, because all of that fossil fuel, all the materials, the aluminum in your thermos bottles, your clothing, everything else, so much of that is extracted from ecosystem adjacent or hotspots, ecosystem hotspots. So Biodiverse Cities, this publication, lays out the constituent elements of what biodiversity means in a city and how we can address it. I know I'm going through this very quickly, but just to show you some work that we've taken action on in biodiversity, we've worked a lot for 10 years now in Colombia, and currently are working in Quibdó and Leticia. We've just finished a project in Mocoa. Quibdó and Leticia is on the Amazon River. Quibdó is one of the wettest cities in the world. It gets rain 363 days a year, and is extraordinary because of that. It's actually the Afro-descendant diaspora for Colombia. The Afro-descendant peoples were pushed to the Pacific zone. Super rainy, super humid, really difficult to live in this area, and they were pushed into that area and made an extraordinary, developed an extraordinary group of towns and cities, and interestingly enough, collectively owned property in that area. Anyway, we're working in these two places. In Quibdó, projects are getting towns in the Pacific, Quibdó in particular, direct access to carbon markets, getting that city to not have to go through the federal government to access the carbon market and other things. And then this is an image that I took on one of my trips to the Amazon. These are protected areas in the Amazon, some of them indigenous controlled areas, which, not surprisingly, there's a lot of protected area in the Amazon. This is the gas and oil footprint in the Amazon. So these are oil and gas blocks that are being actively or will be developed, an enormous area of the Amazon. And so this is part of working in Leticia in the Amazon on how that city can actually mitigate the environmental consequences of that kind of action. And we use a lot of machine learning now. We use a lot of other technologies to assess the intensity, resource intensity of cities and the biodiversity of cities. And in Mocoa, we use drones and machine learning to assess the climate vulnerability of that place. And I realize now I've gone way over time. So I just want to recognize my team that I've worked with for several years, Marcela Angel, who's Colombian, done most of our work in Colombia, and Norhan Bayoumi, who's done most of our machine learning work. Here are the references that you'll have. Thank you so much. So sorry I went over time.
No, absolutely. To that point, I've been furiously, at lunch, we can add 3 more folks to lunch. So sign yourself up. But you please use, for those attending the lunch, the larger, there's a larger table in the, perfect, you got this. So thank you so much for joining us. We should have had 3 hours, but thank you all. We are back here at 1:30 for another panel, so please be back at 1:25 for a 1:30 start.